Hey, it's Dave from ThinkOutsideTheSlide.com, and today I want to show you the basics of how I created this visual. So this is a visual that I created. Someone had said that the situation they're running into is they have 4 criteria that they score each of these 6 banks on. So let me go up. This is the initial data table that they said they had. Now obviously I've changed some details to hide who it is. But this is what they had. They said, how do we show this visually? And so what I did is I created this visual. And so what we see here is that for each criteria, we see a dark gray bar that represents the score, how much the bank scored on that criteria. And then a light gray bar that is the gap between what the score was and the maximum possible score. So the maximum possible score on any criteria is 5. That just happens to be this example. Where the bank that scored the lowest on that particular criteria, that is in orange, and the bank that scored the highest, that is in green. And this is all done dynamically, so when the scores change, the orange or the green bar could move depending on how that's done. And this is all one graph. It's all one graph. So how does this get created? And to make this a little simpler, I'm going to use a just 2 criteria scenario, just makes it simpler, and walk through sort of how this is set up and what the data table is for the chart, drawing from the data that comes in from the analysis. So our analysis is here. We have our criteria values, we have our bank. Now, the first thing I do is I add helper cells. Well, helper cells are, in general, the sort of general definition of a helper cell is any cell that you're using to help in a calculation that is not actually part of the data. So in this case, it is the maximum score for each of the criteria. And you'll notice I have set it to 5 because that's what it is in this case, but it's variable. So you could change it depending on your criteria, and different criteria might have different maximum scores. So it does make it flexible for you. And then let me scroll down to our chart data table here. And the chart data table has each of the banks listed, and it also has this first row here, which just has an A in it. What is that? Well, this first row is going to be used to position the name criteria 1 or criteria 2 on top of that set of bars. And so essentially what we have is we have a category that is not going to actually have a label. I'm going to remove the A later on, but it allows us to have a data series just for that name. So we'll get into that. So let's take a look. So we have each criteria. We have 3 of our data series: score, best, and worst. So the way that this works is that any bank will have a value in only one of those 3 data series. Either it's a score, because it wasn't the minimum or maximum, or it's the best, or it's the worst. So let's take a look at the formulas here and see how this works. So I'm going to zoom in on the formula bar here so we can see it a little better. So this is the formula bar for our just regular score. And what it says is, we'll go to the inner formula first. Or, so it says if, either B6 equals the maximum or B6 equals the minimum. So if it's either of those, then we don't want to use this. That's why there's the not. So the formula says if it's not the minimum or the maximum, then put in B6. And if it is either of those, then put in the NA error value. Now the NA error value might seem a little strange to some people, going, why would I want to put an error value in a chart? I mean, isn't that going to look awful? Well, it would, except for the fact that in Excel charts, an NA error value is not shown in the chart, which is a great advantage because we can put that value in and know it's not going to show up, it's not going to cause a mess, but it allows us to be much more flexible. So that's how we look at the score. So we check if it's not minimum, not maximum, then put that in. If not, you get an NA error value. So you can see we have the score here because it's not the minimum or the maximum. But for bank 3, for example, we don't have a score there. We have the NA error value because it is one of those others. So when we're looking for, let's look for the best. So the best, it's a simpler formula actually here. The simple formula is if B6 is the maximum of B6 to B11, meaning it's the highest value, then put that in. If not, the NA error value. And so it's always referring to our criteria here. B6 to B11 is criteria 1 for bank 1 to 6. And similarly, the formula for the worst says, is it the minimum of that range? If it is, we use the value. If not, we put in the NA error value. So what we end up with is again, every bank only has a score in one of these 3 data series. Why do we split them into different data series? Because it allows us to do the formatting. And you're going to see that when I actually create the chart. Then we have this fill data series. So the fill data series is going to be that light gray that goes from the end of whichever color bar it is to the maximum score. And our formula here, let's take a look at that. So the formula here is B16, so the maximum, we draw that again from this cell here, the maximum that we put in, minus, and then we have to add up those values. Now, the problem with adding the values when we do that is that if it's an NA value, and we know 2 of them are going to be that NA value, it will error. That's why we use this function called if NA. And if NA says if the cell that I'm telling you about, if that's NA, then what value do I want to use? So I say if NA B24, use 0. So if whatever the cell is, if it's the NA error value, it uses 0. So that gets around the problem with the math. So it will properly subtract the 1 value that is being shown. That allows us to create a data series that has that light gray part, which is what's going to show people how far was this bank away from scoring the maximum on this particular criteria. Then we have the criteria 1 data series. And you'll notice here, let me zoom in, you'll notice I am drawing the value here from that data table that came in from the analysis. So this again makes it flexible. You're not hard coding anything here. And the value here is now just simply B16. So it's whatever the maximum is. That means that when we position it and we center it, it's going to be in the center above those bars. Then we have a spacer. Now the spacer serves the purpose of splitting the 2 sets of bars. And as you saw in the original, I had 4 sets of bars, so we'd have additional spacers later on. And the spacer, what I do is I set, again, a helper value right here, 0.1. And what I'm doing there is as I'm saying, this is the percentage, 0.1 being 10%. I want the space to be 10% of the maximum value. So when we look at the formula here, and take a look at the formula up in the formula bar, you'll notice it has the percentage multiplied by the maximum. What this means is that you can have it automatically adjust when the maximum changes. If you wanted to have more space between, you just change 1 value there, that helper cell of G21, and it automatically changes everything. Then we do the same for score 2. So for each of the criteria, we set up the same set of formulas, saying, if it is not the minimum or maximum, then put the value, if not, NA. And again, the criteria 2, we have the same value being what's the maximum here. And then you can just build it. You would add, if you had 4, you would add another spacer and so on. That's why you saw so many data series in the example where you saw the 4 criteria. You just keep adding, duplicating this sort of idea going on and on. And because everything is set as formulas from the data series, when the data changes, the graph automatically updates. And then what I've done down here is I've added the title I want to use in this cell, because Excel charts allow you to have a cell as the title. So once I've set up my data table, I'm going to select all of these cells. Obviously, I'm not selecting the helper cell, and I'm making sure I have that A in the first row. The reason that's necessary is because Excel assumes that if there's nothing in that category label in that row, it assumes that the data series names are 2 rows. So we just need to kind of fool Excel, trick Excel. So I'm going to select all of that, and I'm going to go to my insert, I'm going to go to my charts and I'm going to select my stacked bar chart, my regular stacked bar chart, just the default stacked bar chart, not the 100% stacked bar, just the regular stacked bar chart. Okay, so I'll select that, and when we start to take a look at it, we go, whoa, that doesn't look like it's supposed to here. I'll just turn that off for now. Well, what it's done is that it has swapped the rows and the columns in the chart. Well, nice thing is on the chart design ribbon right up here, we have this button called switch row column. We click on that. Now it's the way that we're expecting it to look. So I'm going to make this larger so we can see it and see how things work. So first thing we always do with bar charts, whether it's stacked bar or regular bar chart, is to switch the order of the vertical category labels because it goes from bottom to top. So I'm just going to select the vertical axis here, hit Control-1 to open up the formatting pane, and go over here. This is the checkbox we always have to use, categories in reverse order. Check that, and immediately everything changes the way we want it to. Now I can go in the chart data table, I can remove this A because Excel has already accepted that, so I can remove the A, and now that's there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start formatting the data here, and we're going to set it so that we have our, so the first set of bars is going to be those that have a score, but they're not the minimum or the maximum. First thing we're going to do is we're going to actually go over and set the gap width because we want these to be a little wider. So our gap width, the default is 150%. We're going to go in and change that to 50%. That looks better. Okay. And now I'm going to set the formatting. So I'm just going to go to the format ribbon here, the chart format ribbon, and I'm going to set the shape fill to the dark gray that I want to use. And now that's set, and I can go ahead. So the next one here is worst. Okay, so this is the one we want to set to the orange. So I'm going to set the shape fill to the orange color here. And the best one, I'm going to set that shape fill to the green color here. Now the yellow is where we have to set it to the light gray to indicate how far away from the maximum is this particular score. So I'm going to set that fill color to this light, we'll make it even lighter, that light gray there. The spacer, we don't want there to be anything in there because the spacer is supposed to be empty. So we'll set that shape fill to no fill. And then do the same formatting for our next set of columns. So I'll set the shape fill to the dark gray here. This one is the worst. Okay, so that'll be the orange. This is the best, so that'll be the green. I'm just duplicating exactly what I did before, and this will be the light gray. Okay, now what we can do is we can get rid of the legend because we don't need that anymore. So we'll uncheck the legend, we'll uncheck the grid lines, and the horizontal axis here. These numbers actually don't make any sense because they're additive. So we can go there. Now, some people will just delete this horizontal axis. I like to keep it around because it's easier to access if you need to change it later on. What I'll do instead is I'll go to the formatting, and what I'll do, I'll zoom in here so we can see this, and what I'll do is I'll just change the label position from next to axis. I'll say none. And that removes the labels, but it doesn't actually remove that axis, even though it looks like it did. The two criteria data, the names here, what we want to do is we want to select it. We want to add a data label that's the name of the series and then make it invisible. Or we can do the invisibility first. So I'll set the shape fill to no fill. Then I'll add a data label. And I'm going to go to more options here. And in my data label options, I'm going to go to the label options here. And what I'm going to do, I'll zoom in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want it to be the series name, not the value, and I'll select the center label position, which is what I want it to be. So now you can see that that label criteria 1 is centered over that set of bars. And I can do the same thing for criteria 2. Set that to no fill, add a data label, more options, add the series name, not the value, leave it centered, and there we go. So now all I have to do is I just add the data labels for each of the bars, the visible part. The light gray we don't need to add a data label for, so I can simply add the data label, and I can add it in the center if I want. That's the easiest place to put it. Do the next one, add it in the center there, and the next one, add it in the center there. Same here, center. And you'll notice by keeping the skittle open, I can just keep adding them without having to reopen the skittle every time. Now what we do is we simply go ahead and change the font color. So to change the font color, we go back to the home ribbon and just change the font color here. Let's say it's white. We'll do that for the other ones as well. And these three. Just repetitive. Some of the stuff is just repetitive. It just has to be done. That's the way it works. And the last thing is the chart title. So to draw the chart title from the cell here, A31, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click in the chart title. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click in the formula bar. And I'm going to say equals, and then I'm going to click on that particular cell. And you'll notice what it did is it entered into the formula bar that particular cell reference. So it knows that's what I want to use for this title. I hit enter, and now it automatically picks it up. So next month, when the month changes, you can just go into this cell and say instead of June, let's say it's July. And you'll notice I changed the cell data, and it automatically updates. So you could actually drive this cell as a formula that concatenates some different information together. And when that information changes in the data table, it automatically creates this title, and it puts it automatically into the chart because you use the chart title from a cell. So that's how we create this particular visual. The last thing that I would do, you see this vertical line here. We don't need that. So what I can do is I can select my vertical axis again, Control-1 to open up the formatting, and just go over to the fill and line options and the line option and say no line. And that removes the line. So now I have my visual that shows how each of the banks ranked on each of the criteria and identifies the best performing and worst performing on that particular criteria. Okay, so that's how we create this visual, and it can be a really good visual to take this table of numbers that you might have been presenting about criteria and turning it into a meaningful visual that allows better discussion. If you like more videos like this, subscribe to the channel, check out all the other videos on the channel. Thanks for watching.